Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman, and I'm privileged to serve as the board chair of Israel Policy Forum. Today's webinar is made possible by the generous support of our donors. So for those donors who are joining us today, thank you very much. Your generosity is critical in helping us to reach tens of thousands of policymakers, community leaders, journalists, and interested individuals like today's audience members. If you're not yet an Israel Policy Forum donor, please join us and visit israelpolicyforum.org/giving to make a gift today. Thank you. Now on to today's special program. Welcome to our election night in Israel briefing. The polls just closed in Israel, I believe 4 minutes ago. So in just a moment, we're going to share live exit poll results from the 3 leading Israeli TV stations. Exit polls will give us a first indication of whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu will have a clear path to form a coalition, or whether Israel is headed for yet more political deadlock. And I just would note that just like in our country, the exit polls are not always reliable sources of how the electorate voted. Sometimes they've been more accurate than others. And obviously, while we'll be discussing exit polls, it will probably take a couple of days for everything to sort itself out so we get the final results. I'm happy to be joined by our team of Israel Policy Forum experts, Policy Director Michael Koplow, Policy Advisor Shira Efron, Israel Fellow Nimrod Novik, and Communications Director Eli Koaz. Few reminders before we begin. We encourage you to ask questions of our speakers, which we will address in the latter half of today's program. To submit a question, please type it out in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Next, a recording of this program will be posted later today on our website, www.israelpolicyforum.org, as an episode of our Israel Policy Podcast. So with that, I'm going to turn to you, Nimrod, first to give us some idea of what you're seeing as far as some of the initial exit poll results. Nimrod.
2 points that I would like to make before we look at the numbers. One, as you pointed out, exit polls are, especially in a tight election like this one, exit polls leave us with a lot to wait for. I just remind you that the last time in most exit polls, Netanyahu had 60, and a few days later it turns out to be 58, and that's all the difference in the world. Second important note is that in our system, we really know the election results on the day that the government is sworn in, because chasing defectors and coalition maneuvering play a very important role in structuring coalition, especially in such a fragmented political system with so many parties that do make it, and they're so small, and you got to accumulate one after the other in a puzzle, endless puzzle, with most of them ideologically not homogeneous. Very difficult task. So today, most observers tend to analyze the results by 2 criteria. One is a traditional one, which is probably not relevant this time, which is left and right. The other one, which is relevant this time, is yes Bibi, no Bibi, which what these elections have been all about. So if you look at, say, Channel 13, which is my favorite because of the credibility of its pollster, Professor Camille Fuchs, if you look at their numbers, then the no Bibi coalition is far more substantial than the Bibi coalition. But then again, one party holds the key, and that is Yamina. If it joins Bibi, he has it. If it joins the no Bibi coalition, he's out. Second issue is that only on Friday, we're going to have the final results, even though they will not be submitted to the president yet, which is the formal act of closure. But nonetheless, the numbers are going to be ready on Friday, because the number of absentee ballots is far less substantial than the Election Commission had been planning for, given coronavirus and so on. And last preliminary comment, the new Arab party called Ra'am which is the Islamist wing, southern wing of the Islamist party, didn't make it by all three polls, but all three pollsters are very cautious because it might make it, and if it makes it, it is 4. As you all know, the threshold for making it to the Knesset is 3.25% of the total votes. And Ra'am, that particular party, is just slightly beneath the threshold. And if it crosses, you have another totally different calculation of the electoral map.
And Nimrod, just one point of clarification before we pull up, if we're ready, some of the live polling, but you referred to absentee ballots. I just want to make sure our viewers know that there really isn't mail-in balloting in Israel like there is in this country, which of course has been the source now of some contention since the legitimately run election in our country. But am I correct that the only people who are allowed to vote absentee are diplomats posted abroad? I don't know if there are any other categories of Israelis, but essentially you have to show up in Israel to vote, right?
I use the term in a slightly, as you pointed out, I use the term in slightly misleading way. There is a system whereby not only diplomats, but also soldiers vote in what we call double envelopes. The soldier puts it in, seals it up, and then the system seals a second envelope. This time, this was extended to certain cases related to the COVID situation. They expected something like 600,000 of those, but it's not going to come, 60,000 of those, but it's not going to come even close to that. So it is still significant, again, because parties are on the threshold, making it or not making it, on the verge of making or not making the threshold, and any additional 10,000 votes that can divert it in one way or the other.
Thanks, Nimrod. Eli, are we ready for, or do you want me to ask another question?
Yes, no, we're ready. I'm just
okay.
going to pull up we're going to look at channel 12's exit poll, and as the call goes on, we'll go over other exit polls as well. But so we saw some very interesting things that happened. The first was voter turnout. Now, last election, voter turnout was very, very high. It was the highest of this latest election cycle. This time it was very different. I guess there was some election fatigue in Israel. People are saying that it was especially low among Arab Israelis. So we see in this election, this is as of 8 p.m., that the voter turnout was 60.9%. And that's almost 5 percentage points down from 8 p.m. in March 2020. Going down and looking at, this is the channel 12 exit poll. We can see Netanyahu's Likud with 31 seats. That is better than Netanyahu had been polling throughout the campaign. We also have Yesh Atid at 18 seats. If we look at the other parties, again, I want to, before I go on, this can change, right? So these exit polls, in the last election, exit polls were very, very accurate. But in 2015, for example, for those that remember, the Likud and the Zionist Union were tied when the exit polls were announced. But when the real votes were tallied, Netanyahu actually grew a lead of 6 seats. So after Yesh Atid, we have Shas with 9 seats and the Joint List with 9 seats. Now, both of these parties were not polling as the 3rd and 4th largest party respectively. That was actually Yamina with 8 seats and Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope, which started with great promise in the polls. It looks like they'll finish between 6 and 7 seats. A lot of people spoke about Meretz being in trouble, and we have to see where the other channels put Meretz. But Channel 12 have merits at 6 seats. So their campaign of a really desperate plea to get Israeli left voters to come out and vote, it looks like it worked. Merav Michaeli's Labor Party with an impressive showing, if this is correct, with 7. And something should be said about Benny Gantz, who was under the threshold in many of the polls. Actually, it looks like he'll finish with around 6 or 7 seats. And there's Israel Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, that campaigned strongly against the ultra-Orthodox. It looks like he'll finish with 6 seats, which isn't, he definitely expected to do better. And we have the religious Zionist party, obviously, that includes the Kahanist faction led by Bezalel Smotrich, but Itamar Ben-Gvir also a part of that list. 7 seats is definitely a great accomplishment for them. But really what this comes down to is the situation of the blocks. Now, in other elections, in the previous elections, it was left versus or center left versus right. Here, it's the pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu camp. If we look at Channel 12, Netanyahu, he has 61 with Yamina, but again, this is a very fluid situation. As Nimrod mentioned, if Ram is able to get above the threshold once the votes are counted, then this could change completely. So we really need to follow this closely. And these are very slim margins that we're talking about, but really a really close election and a good chance of continued political deadlock, Susie. So I'll work on this and we'll try to do some coalition scenarios later on, but I'll send it back to you for now.
Thank you. Okay. So Shira, I'm going to turn to you. What are your conclusions from what you're seeing? I'm just going to go around. This is going to be more of a free-for-all, hopefully in the best sense of the word. But Shira, just looking at these results, which are of course the preliminary results, and there's still some more sorting out that will need to be done. And as Nimrod noted, we won't have all of the votes even in until Friday. But what do you think, Shira, and what are your takeaways? And I have an additional question about Yair Lapid, but let's just start with everyone's takeaways. I'll just do a robin round of takeaways, starting with Shira.
Thanks, Susie. And I very much agree with Nimrod. Of course, it's way too early to say, especially when we talk about low voter turnout, which is actually plays in favor of the smaller parties, because it reduces the number of total votes, total votes to pass the threshold. So we might still be in for surprises, and the small parties are going to affect the overall balance. So with all the usual caveats that apply, right? And this could all change. And as Nimrod said, it could change an hour before going to the president to get the mandate to forming a government. The way I am reading the numbers now, and they're very different. There are 3 exit polls that we're seeing, and those also have very different numbers. But if Naftali Bennett's party joins Netanyahu's coalition, it seems like Netanyahu can form a government under all of these scenarios. Now, I may have done the arithmetics wrong, so they could be off with, but I think he's getting to 61 with Naftali Bennett's party under any scenario. So it's very tight, but it seems like we figured before, I think, there's no surprise there that Netanyahu has an easier path to forming a coalition than anyone else. No big. One thing that I think is concerning and frankly a bit upsetting, no matter if you're sort of on the right in terms of your views on national security issues, I think that the fact that Smotrich's party, right, religious Zionism with Ben-Gvir, that it pulls in 7 seats like Labor, possibly more than Labor, of course, more than Meretz, but also like Gideon Sa'ar and Bennett. That says a lot. Netanyahu worked very hard to get them to where they are, and it worked. But this is a party that I see a question in the chat about LGBT rights. I mean, this is a question. This is a party that's against LGBTQ. It's against Arabs. It's against pretty much everyone who's not them. So I think it is concerning for domestic issues. Of course, it could have implications for other issues as well, but I think this is concerning. Finally, maybe just one anecdote. It's not the first time that this happens. You know, Bennett is going to be the kingmaker now. His party is going to have maybe 7 seats. It's half of what he had in polls, what, a month ago, 2 months ago? So I think it's kind of this craziness in the Israeli system that is such a small party, really, that gets such a percentage of the Israeli voters can determine the makeup of the next coalition. But it'll be interesting to see the numbers as we keep going when Eli brings up more stats. Thank you.
Nimrod, same question to you. What are your takeaways with these early results and recognizing that things could change somewhat, but still, as of 10:20 in Israel, the night of the election?
I'll go on the safe side. No predictions, but perhaps some conclusions. I would say one conclusion is that on the right, the banner or the exclusive platform of not Bibi proved insufficient. Both Sa'ar was close to 20 when he launched it. Bennett was high when he launched it, and both of them collapsed to a single digit because the message of I am on the right, but I'll replace Bibi was not enough to bring enough voters for either Sa'ar or Bennett. The second, I think it is, you know, to state the obvious, with 33 or 34, again, assuming we take the exit polls at face value, with 33, 34, obviously the job for Bibi to form a coalition is far easier than for anyone else. And he has more like-minded or ideologically kin parties to choose from. To see a coalition of 61 or more on the center left is very, very difficult. First of all, there is no center left 61, and it requires somebody from the, shall we say, center right, and that will be just 20% discount on the extent of that Naftali Bennett is on the center, whereas he is a solid right. You really need a real good acrobat, political acrobat on the center left in order to be able to form a coalition. Netanyahu is better positioned. Nonetheless, it always looks easier on election day or election night than once negotiations begin. And if the numbers are right, he is short of 61. He's just by one poll, he's 60, and but his block, including Yamina, is 60, and by the other one, it's 59. I believe if I got the numbers right. My memory, I don't have the numbers in front of me. But so we're going to see a chase after defectors, after a chase after parties, a chase after individual members of various parties to cross over to the Netanyahu camp. Again, just by the sheer initial numbers, his prospects are easier, but it's not going to be easy. And it's not going to be fast. We always assume on election day, and the day after, and the week later, that this time a coalition will be formed fairly rapidly. I don't remember the last time that it did not exhaust the time allotted by law, because no party makes the ultimate concession prior to the last minute.
So Michael, initial takeaways, and I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll get to audience questions because we already have a considerable number of questions, which is great.
A few things. So first, the exit polls are what the exit polls are. I think that even in the last election, last March, election number 3, the initial exit polls had Bibi, if I'm recalling correctly, had the Bibi block at 61, and then it turned out that the Bibi block was 58. So, there's a good chance that by tomorrow morning, it'll move 2 or 3 seats in one direction or another. So I'm not sure we can, take any conclusions about coalition or no coalition. But with that caveat, three kind of broad things strike me in looking at this. The first is that there was increasing talk even after the first 3 elections that there was going to be a larger groundswell of anti-Bibi sentiment, right? Gideon Sa'ar broke off, formed his own party. We have these reports about the increasing numbers of demonstrators at Balfour. There were demonstrations just this past week. The news station said that it was 20,000 people. The organizer said it was 50,000 people. And it turns out that Likud is exactly where Likud was. And basically, these numbers of pro-Bibi versus anti-Bibi don't really move. So, I think how you feel about Prime Minister Netanyahu is baked in, really, no matter what happens. Second, there is a definite move based on these exits toward a more extreme right wing than we've seen. And it isn't only that religious Zionism under Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and remember, Ben-Gvir is literally the head of the Kahanist party. It isn't just that these exits have them at 7. It's that, we see some of that coming probably from UTJ, which is a Haredi party, but it looks like some of them may have defected possibly to religious Zionism. We see a more, and Gideon Sa'ar and Tikva Chadasha, New Hope, which was supposed to be the more stately, Mamlachtiyut party on the right, that came out of the gate in the polls at 20. If they're really at 6, it just shows people moving more towards extremes on the right. And that is a very worrisome development because nobody should downplay just how extreme religious Zionism is. And it isn't just about Ben-Gvir. Smotrich is pretty far out there too. And third, I wouldn't discount if these numbers turn out to be somewhat correct, that there is going to be a move among some other parties that are willing to be enticed by Prime Minister Netanyahu if it means keeping Smotrich and Ben-Gvir out of the government. So, if the Bibi bloc right now plus Bennett is 61, and you replace religious Zionism with Benny Gantz and Kachol Lavan, and you're at the same numbers, Benny Gantz joined with Netanyahu last time, saying that only he could prevent a catastrophe. He can very easily talk himself into doing the same thing now to prevent the catastrophe of the Kahanists being in government. And Bibi wouldn't have to promise him a prime ministerial rotation to get it. The same, by the way, goes for Gideon Sa'ar. It's one thing to say that you're never going to sit with Bibi under any circumstance when you're polling at 20 seats. When you come from Likud and you've been in Likud your whole life, and now you have 6 seats, and you can talk yourself into joining a government if it means keeping out Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, that's a possibility too. So, to Nimrod's very early point to kick this off about how you don't actually know what's going to happen until you see the coalition negotiations. I think that a lot of these assumptions, that we've been throwing around now for a few months may turn out to be completely incorrect based on what these numbers end up as.
Thanks, Michael. Question about Yair Lapid, and Shira, maybe you'll take this first. He has built a formidable party, Yesh Atid, with a strong national infrastructure. But this was really the first time he was considered a genuine challenger for the prime ministership. If he fails in this round to be in a position to form the government, and based on what we're talking about now, that doesn't look too likely, do you expect him to have another shot in a future election, or do you think center-left voters will look for new challengers to Bibi to emerge?
It's a really good question. I think Yesh Atid is an interesting phenomenon, right? Because if you look at other parties that have gone into coalitions with Netanyahu before, you had Kadima earlier, and now, of course, with blue-white, the base you know, the constituents, they don't forgive, right? So the parties really crash. And Lapid went in, he was Netanyahu's finance minister, right? And still, I think, if I remember the numbers correctly, it's very hard. We had this number 4 in 2 years, but even when they crashed, it wasn't like going to 2, right, or disappearing completely. They have sort of like a solid base of 10, and now the numbers have grown again based on what we're seeing with the exit polls. So they seem to really have a good infrastructure and a good base and a solid base of supporters. The question is, what alternative would emerge, right? I don't see anything else emerging at the moment. And Lapid has established himself as someone who's been, at least for this camp, he's been behaving pretty responsibly. Netanyahu has been trying to, you know, all what Netanyahu is saying is like, oh, Yair Lapid can be prime minister, and this is either me or Yair Lapid who's inexperienced. Yair Lapid basically disappeared in the last few weeks. And he's also made an effort to make sure that all the parties on the center left, all as if there are many of them, but that Meretz and Labor and that they actually pass the threshold, so that they form a bloc. And even really there's such a resentment and so much bad blood between him and Benny Gantz, and even that stopped. Just being the, you know, the sort of responsible grown-up of saving the camp, the other camp. So I don't see him disappearing, but then again, just with all these new parties that keep emerging every new round, who knows? Who knows? And who knows when the next round will be, right? Because it takes time also to build the infrastructure, and that time will tell if there's a stable government or we're going into 5th elections sometime soon.
Thanks, Shira. Nimrod, did Merav Michaeli breathe new life into the Labor Party and the center-left coalition, if you will? It sounds like both Meretz and Labor will have made the threshold, which was certainly something that couldn't have necessarily been predicted even a few days ago. And you can talk a little bit also, we've mentioned the fact that Meretz really made a push to get over the threshold, and it looks like that was successful. But can you talk a little bit about center left and where you see this going, and what will be the role of the Labor Party with, I mean, it's a much diminished Labor Party from the past, but it looks like it's surviving to live another day in the next Knesset. Nimrod?
Yeah, I mean, she took the brand out of the dead. Labor was really passé. Nobody gave them any prospects in the future. The sentiment was Labor created the country, established the state, led it in its formative years. It has done its job. We don't need it anymore. And successive chairmen proved that right. Failed one after the other. And then came Merav and gave it really a new life. Few expected Labor plus Meretz to be at 14, because it's always what is the term? Kelim shluvim. What is the term? When you take from the one, you get it to the other. It's the same pool of voters.
Yeah.
And the assumption was that if Labor will be at 7, 8, 9, Meretz will disappear. And yet, again, assuming the exit polls are correct, both of them are around 7, and maybe upward in terms of 7.5 or whatever. So that's a very, very interesting showing. I would add to that, you know, when we look at the last, not just 4 elections, but even beyond that, we will find out that nothing has changed. Really, nothing has changed. If you look at what is center-left, what did it show? So one day it moved to Labor when Bougie was still there, Bougie Herzog. Then Labor was 24. You take now the center-left, and the pool is the same pool, not much. Israeli politics apparently are far more static. Now, the moves of one seat here, one seat there, can change the culture of the country and the nature of the country. If tomorrow he forms a government, as Michael spoke about it, with Ben Gvir, and in a coalition of 61, the king is not the king, is not the prime minister. It's the last Knesset member whose vote you need. What will be the demands of those extreme fascist, Kahanist members of Knesset and maybe members of cabinet? What will they demand? Last comment, I wanted just to add one thing to what Shira has said about Yair Lapid. We have two models of what Yair Lapid has done. The first model was Tzipi Livni, and the second one is Yair. And the two of them worked completely differently under similar circumstances. Tzipi Livni stayed out of the coalition. She won the elections. She had more than Netanyahu, failed to form a coalition, didn't join him in a national unity government, stayed out in opposition, and disappeared, to my great regret, personally. Yair Lapid was in, left, stayed out, and it gave him a new lease of life in Israeli politics. Now, we don't know if he will be out or in, because we don't know what coalition we're going to have. But I certainly agree with Shira that he has played his cards very, very well, including in running a very smart campaign, sort of Biden style, in terms of low-key, very little presence, and as Shira said, the responsible adult in a very messy political system.
Thank you, Nimrod. Michael, one question for you, and then I'm going to turn to audience questions. How might the coalitions formed in Israel impact the relationship between the Israeli government and the Biden administration, especially if it ends up being a far right-wing government?
It's a good question. I'll say that even before these exits, I think that it was difficult to see a path to a government that was not helmed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the exits so far show that too. Even if the anti-Bibi bloc is above 60, it still is very difficult for them to form a government. So let's assume we're talking here about a government led by Prime Minister Netanyahu of some sort. He's a known quantity in DC at this point. He's been around a long time. So far, in the early days of the Biden administration, there seem to be efforts on both sides to not have any high-profile disagreements between the United States and Israel. I think that will likely continue for a bit. But with that said, if he forms a government that includes Ben Gvir, even if Ben Gvir himself is not a minister, and he has made that promise, but who knows? Even if Ben Gvir is not a minister, it is going to cause tension in the United States. The first election, all the way back in April 2019, which I know is only 2 years ago, but given everything that's transpired since, seems like a decade ago, people will recall the just wall-to-wall condemnation in the United States, including from staunchly pro-Israel groups, just over the fact that anybody was even willing to abet the Kahanists and Otzma Yehudit getting to the Knesset. And now here we are sitting, they're in the Knesset. Even if they don't end up with 7 seats like the exit polls, they're not dropping below the threshold, and they very well may be, the linchpin of a coalition, and that is going to cause problems. Even though people have not made as much of a stink about it this time as they did 2 years ago, because then it was unprecedented. It's going to look very bad, and efforts to just brush it away as if it doesn't matter are going to land very awkwardly here in the United States. So if that happens, it will cause tension, but ultimately, again, we're talking about, I think, either Prime Minister Netanyahu forming an actual government or him remaining Prime Minister in a transitional government in the time before a 5th election. And I think what we've seen over the past few months is likely what we're going to get until we see what type of government he actually forms.
Thank you. So let me get to audience questions. Milton Sheeman asks, was an agreement reached between Bennett and Netanyahu yesterday? And if so, what were the terms? Do we know?
Yes, we do. I mean, to the extent that we know.
Okay, what do we
To the
know?
extent that we know, there was no agreement. There was a challenge, not an agreement. Netanyahu challenged Bennett to commit not to serve under Yair Lapid. And Bennett, in a slightly less sophisticated way, challenged back and says, I will commit not to sit under Yair Lapid if you commit not to sit with Ra'am, the Arab party. So the media picked up the first half of the Bennett answer, I will not sit under Lapid, and forgot the second half where he challenged Netanyahu that did not respond.
But I'll just add on top of that, this is one of the reasons why I think putting Bennett in his own category as if he's undecided isn't quite apt, right? This election was really about Bibi versus not Bibi, and the pledge that Bennett signed on live television was that he won't sit with Yair Lapid. And again, as Nimrod points out, his condition back was now you, Bibi, come and sign a pledge saying you won't sit with Mansour Abbas and Ra'am. And it looks like they're not going to make the Knesset. So, if you take all that together, it's simply a pledge to sit with Bibi. So, they don't seem to have any agreement, but to me, Bibi belongs in the Bennett belongs in the Bibi camp, not really in the undecided camp. But that's just one person's opinion.
I want to just pause. Sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead, Sheila. Yeah.
No, I just want to add, because we are mentioning Ram, and I think it's interesting. Under all exits show that it's not passing, but the head of the party, Mansour Abbas, is very confident that they will get 4 seats, right? It's 0 or 4, and if that happens, it really changes everything, because the way it's done, you take all the votes and recount them. So this could really change the picture in a very, very fundamental way. So I think it is important to note. And then whatever Bennett's pledge is will be very interesting to see. I think also maybe just before we go to the next election, I think maybe this election is also on, Bibi or not Bibi. But we have to remember that it's within a context, right? There is identity politics here, right? When Bibi has a trial, he doesn't represent just himself, the persona. It's the whole camp. It's the elites. So there is something bigger about this, and the views of Israelis on the role of the courts, the judiciary. There are other issues, I think, that play into this that Bibi symbolizes. But it's not just him, the persona, so much. And that to me is my feeling is maybe because there hasn't been someone like Benny Gantz that you had in previous elections who stood as a direct competitor, right? He wasn't just like the largest party or getting the most votes, but also in polls, he was shown to be trusted as someone who could be a prime minister. And now you just don't have it. So that I think also affects what people think and what they vote on.
Thank you, Sheila. Eli, I think we have some more information that you want to put up on the screen, please.
Yes, I'd be happy to. And I also quickly wanted to note that we still have a lot of absentee votes, which are called double ballots in Israel, that will be counted in the coming days. And that could play a big difference. This election, they're supposedly quite a large number of those votes. So that, and also there are votes from the Israeli soldiers. These things could change things here and there, especially if we're talking about very small margins. So here we have the 3 exit polls. They're pretty similar. They're similar when it comes to the blocks, and that's really what we're looking at here. 2 of them have Netanyahu at 54, and one has Netanyahu at 53. And the anti-Netanyahu block, which all the panelists mentioned, the difficulty of making a government from that block is at 59. And so if we move up here and we have a little coalition simulator, which is a nice way of visualizing how a Netanyahu coalition would look. Netanyahu obviously counts on his party, the Likud, and then right away he'll add Shas and United Torah Judaism, the two ultra-Orthodox parties, and then he'll obviously add the religious Zionist party led by Bezalel Smotrich with Itamar Ben-Gvir. Still not enough, right? But then as soon as Bennett decides that he's going to join Netanyahu, we talked about the agreement that he made. If the exit polls hold, that pushes Netanyahu to 60, like that can push him over. So it's really simple for Netanyahu in a way if these are the final results. And this is a very natural coalition. Sure, Bennett will get some criticism for again joining a Netanyahu government, but at the end of the day, he'll have, I'm sure he'll have a great role and be very influential. And in terms of policy, it'll be a very, very right-wing government. Looking at the alternative, if you have Yesh Atid trying to form a coalition, things get very tricky, right? Because obviously he'll take Labor and Meretz. I assume him and Benny Gantz, though they're rivals, Benny Gantz would be willing to join that coalition. Yisrael Beitenu as well. Gideon Sa'ar expect to be much bigger. And then you're kind of in a funny position, right? With the joint list, even if you have the joint list, you're still not there. And then it's a debate within itself whether the joint list would be part of such a coalition. Without the joint list, let's say you get Yamina, you're just at 60, and obviously the joint list puts you over. But again, these are having the joint list, Yamina, Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope, all together, virtually impossible. So it looks here like Netanyahu is in a very, very good position. Again, I want to say again, it's if the exit polls are accurate. Ram getting over the threshold could change the picture completely. But I think that Netanyahu is a happy camper tonight, and that's the situation right now from the exit polls of the three main channels.
Thank you, Eli. That's really interesting. I can see why you like your job so much. You get to play all day. We have a question from one of our board members, Bob Ellman, who asked, why did Sa'ar's party, New Hope, why did his party's projected seats fall so sharply? And what, if any, role will Lieberman play in forming a coalition government? Nimrod, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, Bob. I would say that both Sa'ar and Bennett had a certain strategy in this campaign, and that strategy completely collapsed. Both of them assumed that they will have enough in order to serve as a center of gravity for a right-center coalition that does away with Netanyahu. And both of them failed. But the two of them played it in two different ways. Sa'ar went anti-Bibi, period. Bennett played a perhaps more sophisticated game of trying to get Likudniks to vote for him by not being anti-Bibi, by wavering, by keeping his options open for both sides. And both these strategies collapsed because of what I think we mentioned at the outset, that it turns out that on the right, a single issue agenda of no Bibi is not enough. And if on everything else you are Likud, then I might as well go with Likud rather than go with a copycat that doesn't offer anything really attractive. So both of them, when they came out of the gate, were close to 20 or around 20. And it didn't take too long for both to shrink to single digit.
Shira, Judy Ike asks, what do these results mean for the joint list and suggest about the future of the Arab vote? And I know in the days leading up to today's election, there was concern about the Arab vote percentages dropping from a really impressive turnout back in the fall. So could you talk a little bit about what do we know, if anything, about the Arab turnout in this election? Maybe it's just too soon to know that, but what are the implications for the joint list, especially with being basically pulled away by Netanyahu's attempts to get them to side with him in a future coalition government?
Yeah, really interesting things are happening, I think, within what we call the Arab sector, although it's not a sector, right? It's 21% of the population, but it's not a homogeneous population. And in this, the joint list had parties that are very different from one another, that are right-wing party and a left-wing party. There's the Hadash, the Communist Party, very different parties that came together because they wanted to increase their political capital. And we did see voting turnout increase in previous rounds. I think the split of the joint list played in favor of those that don't want to see high turnout. At least what I read last, and this could have changed in the last hour, but turnout was really low in Arab towns and cities. There is, we can go into this. There are positive trends that are happening on the Arab streets with more integration into society and to the economy. But there are also negative trends that continue with crime, violence, and a lack of representation, and really generational differences between the old leadership and the public. And that's why it's interesting that you look at Mansour Abbas and I don't know really how many Arabs voted eventually for Likud. I mean, it would be interesting to see. But the idea of we want to improve our quality of life. And to do this, we have to join the government. We have to join the coalition. We have to go, and this is what the playbook of the Haredi parties, right? If non-Zionist Haredi parties can do that, why not the Arabs that are part of this country, that pay taxes, they're citizens? So this is the trend, and it remains to see. Again, we have to see the numbers at the end if Mansour Abbas's party passes the threshold or not. But and what the voter turnout was. It's also important to maybe now there are reports, but at least at the beginning, early on, when you get the reports on voter turnout, it's cumulative. It's not by city, so it's hard for us to say. So it's more from reporting. Okay. That reporters that walked around places. Yeah, I see Nimrod wants to add.
Go ahead, Nimrod.
Ken, I agree completely with what Shira said, and I would like to add a couple of things. First of all, remember, if we wake up tomorrow morning or by Friday and suddenly Ram made it and has 4, then suddenly the Arab vote is again 12, and that's been the tradition. It was 10, 11, 12 for a long time. 15 was unique, and 15 happened for one primary reason, because Netanyahu drove them to the polls by his racist anti-Arab campaign on the eve of that election. And it really steered spirits, and suddenly they had a cause to rally around. Since then, 2 things happened. One, they split, and there's disappointment with that. And 2, there's great disappointment that they did not deliver, that when they had 15, and there was hope that they will get some things done for the Arab sector, that did not happen. So I don't think we can say that turnout collapsed, but it went back to where it used to be before the last time surge.
Okay. We've got a couple of related questions, and I'm going to, I think, direct the first half of this question to our experts in Israel, and then Michael, I'm going to ask you to take the second question. So Nancy Kaplan asks, hi Nancy, why won't Netanyahu pay a price for engineering Ben Gvir's entrance into the Knesset? It would not have happened but for Bibi's machinations. And then Alan Luxembourg asks, I think, a related question. What would be the reaction in Israel if Biden were to communicate to Rivlin that the US would not deal with any government that includes Kahanists? So Michael, we'll save that one for you. But the first one about Bibi paying any kind of a price for getting Ben Gvir into the Knesset. And this, of course, reminds us of Otzma Yehudit, but now it's sort of on steroids. Shira or Nimrod, who would like to take that?
Ladies first, or you want me to go? Okay.
Very polite, Nimrod.
Yeah, because she wants me to be the bearer of bad news. I think that the answer to this question is what happened to Israeli politics on the right. Michael alluded to it in the very early phase in a very important comment. Elements of the right in Israel has gone very far. Netanyahu, not only does he not pay a price for it, but he is the one who legitimized the extreme right, the Kahanist movement. And I guess, if we want to use an analogy, it's what happened in the US when the president legitimized trends that were there. He didn't create them, but people were ashamed to show them, to go out with them in public. And suddenly they came out of the basement. Same happened here. We have undercurrents of racism in society, very deep and quite wide. They were dormant, they were whispered, and Netanyahu opened the gates of hell for them to express themselves. So yes, he's paying the price for it on the left, but the left was not with him anyway. So electorally, no price to be paid.
And
Shira, do you want to add anything? And then I'll turn to Michael for the Ruby Rivlin question.
Yeah, no, I agree with Nimrod 100%. I think those that are paying the price, and I see Dan Rotem, the brilliant director of the Commanders for Israel Security, he also wrote it in the chat. Those that are paying the price, it's the other camp, right? And it's because of the basically Benny Gantz thinking probably for very altruistic reasons that he went into the coalition with Netanyahu, but his base, his constituents see him as betraying them and betraying his promise. And this is the price. I don't see Netanyahu paying any price for any of these things. Just before Michael goes into sort of the U.S. implications on Ben Gvir, and and Michael mentioned it before. I think Smotrich is not much different, right? And he was already transportation minister. So we need to remember, this is not going to be a precedent. It's not going to be new. Yeah, maybe you won't have this center-left party in there that's sort of like as a fig leaf for the bigger policies, but it's not something we haven't seen before. And those are the things that I think us as Israel Policy Forum, we should be concerned about. I don't anticipate, maybe Michael disagrees, I don't anticipate like a clash with the Biden administration and with Netanyahu over the type of coalition that he's building. And maybe there's going to be some condemnation, and Jewish groups are going to be very concerned, right? But like overall, unless we're going to see the big annexation or something big that happens, I don't see the ties being damaged. But it's the little things that are happening gradually. For instance, if Bennett goes into the coalition government and Ayelet Shaked wants to go back into the justice ministry, this is important because she was the most efficient justice minister ever. And she appointed 100 judges, all from the right, all involved in clearing settlements. She changed the ways that Palestinians can appeal in court on housing demolitions and on other things. And this is what changes. This is how we change reality on the ground without the big bang. And I think this is what we should be looking for, even as the numbers clear beyond the big events that could lead to some Biden-Rivlin difficult conversation, if Michael thinks such a conversation is likely to happen.
Michael?
To move to that, I think there's probably a 0% chance that President Biden picks up the phone and calls President Rivlin to try to interfere in the coalition building process. I think that if you have Ben Gvir as a minister, and he's now going to be a member of Knesset at a minimum, I think certainly the United States will refuse to meet with Ben Gvir or anybody from Otzma Yehudit, but I don't think that Ben Gvir or anyone else from Otzma Yehudit is going to even get a whiff of any position that will require them to deal with the United States. Ben Gvir has been going around saying that he wants to be the Minister of Defense for the Galilee and the Negev, because that's where there are lots of Arab citizens of Israel, and he wants to be able to oversee them. And so I don't think that he's interested in anything that's going to require interfacing with the U.S., and certainly the U.S. is not going to be interested in anything that requires them to interface with him or his party.
I have
Yeah.
two footnotes, one each for Shira and Michael. One footnote is that it's not just the U.S. I mean, there is Europe, and Israel dependent on Europe is quite substantial. And Europe is less, as the EU, it is castrated because it needs unanimity, and there's always the one or two or three who will not agree. But independent European governments, especially the big three, I do expect them to make their objections not just known, but felt in concrete ways. The footnote to Shira, though I agree with the bottom line that we are not going to see a big bang, but one thing that we should not rule out is that these guys who are now joining for the first time are the less sophisticated kind of annexationists. Unlike the sophisticated school that goes gradually, piecemeal, creeping annexation created by a puzzle of pieces that very difficult to put together and really realize what they're doing. Legislative, on the ground, infrastructure, pieces here and there. These guys, their appetite is much bigger. They are not as patient. They're not as careful. So there's going to be a toss-up here, or a tug of war here, between Bibi trying to tell them what he always does, let me handle it, slow your horses, and them saying, this is our moment in history. It's the first time that the prime minister is totally dependent on us. And if we don't get it now, we never will. And it will be a tug of war between these two approaches.
Mm. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We could have easily gone another hour. So we'll obviously have you back because there is going to be a lot more to unpack. I just do want to, in closing, first of all, I want to point out something that one of our audience members, Alan Warshaw, rightly mentioned, which is that Gilad Kariv of Labor is the first Reform rabbi to become a member of Knesset. I think he was number 4 on the Labor list. So assuming that the predictions of 6-7 seats hold, he's in the government. Some of us know him and think very highly of him. So hopefully he will add an important voice to the Knesset. And of course, there were a lot of attacks from the Haredim who said they wouldn't be a part of a government if he joined the government. So that's going to be interesting to see if they hold to that or not. Thank you everybody for joining. Obviously, there's going to be a lot on our website. So please go to israelpolicyforum.org for election updates. And please take advantage of our resources, the weekly Koplo column, Israel Policy Pod, which again, this will be a podcast later on today, made available on our website. If you are supporting Israel Policy Forum, thank you very much. It means everything to us. It makes these programs possible. If you are not yet supporting us, but you enjoy being part of these webinars, please consider making a contribution. And stay tuned for an announcement about next Tuesday's webinar. We will return to our normal time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific next Tuesday. Remember, if it's Tuesday, it's an IPF webinar. Between now and then, I want to wish everyone a Chag Pesach Sameach, the Kasher. So everyone have a Zissen Pesach. I hope we can all feast on our liberation and contemplate our liberation anyway. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Shira, Nimrod, and Michael, and Eli, of course. So with that, I want to wish everyone, if you're in Israel, have a good evening. If you're on the East Coast, have a good afternoon. And if you're on the West Coast, have a good afternoon also. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.